Chapter 3, your desired outcomes. So just remember that in the last chapter, we talked broadly about like spatial area, and we start to get into some of the outcomes, and you'll find that I generally will get ahead of myself a little bit on these chapters, but I'm just so excited about this work. So with desired outcomes, we're really going to get into a few different things with that. A lot of the outcomes of your studies are going to be about the budget. What are you working with? Is this a blank check where they said, here's the problem, tell me how much it's going to cost to fix it? Or it says, I want you to fix the problem, but this amount of the problem for this amount of money. Sometimes it's going to depend on what you're able to do. So that's going to get into a lot of how your key tasks and deliverables are going to be shaped. Staff resources is also important because, like I said, part of your scope is to define roles and responsibilities. So money is not only one of your resources, but also the number of people you have that can help deliver this process or the outcome that you want. And not only the number of people, but also be cognizant of what can those people do. On my team, I don't really have folks just yet, since they're all fairly new, that can do some of the more detailed graphics work or some of the detailed like ArcGIS urban work. So those have been all part of my scopes. And then of course, your deadline and your timeline. Is this going to be a compressed timeline, or is this something that you got a little bit of time to work with? Those are all going to be part of things to consider in your desired outcomes. And really what this all comes down to is resources. So as I write my scopes of work, I generally want to always outline a preamble. And this is from a consultant scope that I have out there. And when I say consultant scope, I mean a procurement, like an RFP. I always generally have some type of preamble to let people know what they're getting into. Not only about the specific study that we're going in, but we also want to let them know a little bit about Fort Worth. Not everybody knows we're the 13th or 12th largest city in the country. That yeah, we anchor a metropolitan region with that city to the east known as Dallas. That's about 7 million people. If you kind of take the Fort Worth side by itself with some of the other suburbs, we're about 2.6, 2.7 million people, which puts us similar in size to our sister cities like San Antonio, Austin, or Charlotte, to a lesser extent, Denver. And I just like to let people know, kind of set the stage for them. So a preamble as part of some of your consulting work is going to be important. It gives people a good idea of what they're getting into and your expectations for just general context of the specific project they're working on and the entity they're working for. Those are all going to be really important. I also like to tie my outcomes back to established goals. So that may be through your comprehensive plan or some type of other study that you've done, or a council resolution that's been passed, or any number of things. It really does help give you some degree of motivation and some degree of agency over the direction that you want the project to go in, the study to go in this case. And so I've referenced in this particular example is the urban village program the city of Fort Worth has, where we've defined something like 13 urban villages around the city that are basically these key nodes. They're supposed to be walkable and mixed use. And so I reference that because as we're developing the Butler study, we want to use some of those principles as inspiration as we develop this work. I also tie back to our comprehensive plan. And since I'm in the Transportation and Public Works Department, I tie it back specifically to those transportation goals, that mixed use and walkability isn't just about, having a great place to go, but it's about reducing VMT, vehicle miles traveled, reducing vehicle hours traveled as possible, providing more equitable options on how people are able to get around, and in general, improving air quality and then just improving quality of life and goods movement and all those other things, and multi-mobility and all that good stuff we love to talk about. So I've included all those things within our scope of work. And in addition to that, I, in this particular example, have tried to also summarize the scope just a little bit, based on some of those key tasks that I want. Now, it's not getting into the detailed task. We'll get to that later. This is just outlining generally these, sometimes my scopes get to 10 pages. This is generally what you're going to see in that 10 pages. Still read the 10 pages, but here's a bit of a briefing. So that preamble is really important. And in addition to that context and into those goals that I usually bring up in actually writing my scope, because part of what I want this course to do is not only tell you the elements going to scope, but maybe how to start to structure your thoughts as you go to put your scope together. I also just give a quick bullet of here are the 5 tasks that are going to be included going forward, so people have a general idea of what they're getting into. And I said this before, a lot of times the scopes are going to be repeating yourself, but repeating yourself is not always a bad thing because it gets your point across clear and you can get better outcomes from, in this case, responses from a consultant or whatnot. And I've said before that the budget is incredibly important when it comes to developing your scope of work. And I will drive this home again. Are you setting your study to the budget that you have? Or did you get a budget and you can develop a study around that budget? And so it just depends on what comes first. And that's going to be contingent on the level of detail that you have with money or whatnot. And so one example I have here is just kind of broad policy statements on the left. The example to the far right is a form-based code that we've developed. And actually my studies have allowed me to actually develop, as in the 4 studies that my team's working on right now, we actually have budget to actually get adoptable form-based code out of it. But if I only had half the budget, I wouldn't be able to take these studies that far. And so that's really important to understand these things. You know, policies and recommendations can be pretty broad, but to actually get into more specifics, well, you're really going to need to know exactly what your budget's going to be. And you need to be able to roll those specific deliverables that you want into your key task. And so part of what you want to be able to ask yourself is with these key tasks and deliverables is, do I want something that's adoption ready, or is it just going to be like a new policy or an incentive or something, or is it just going to be standard recommendations that you're going to do a phase 2 on and develop your adoptable policy from that point, or adopt a new budget or new capital plan from that point? You know, is it just conceptual? Is it just concept? Or is it, like I said, adoptable policy? Is it just analysis, you know, that doesn't necessarily maybe get into specific recommendations, but just food for thought? Your budget's going to be able to drive that. Is it going to be project level to where we can actually get some scoped projects, which is another course that I'll be talking about, are scope projects? Is it going to be strategies that you just want out of this? And that kind of gets into, is it conceptual? Is it pretty pictures? Or does it get into more detailed strategies? There's a whole spectrum of detail you can get out as far as your deliverables and your outcomes. But 2 things I can tell you're always going to want is your quantity. So at the very end of my scopes of work, I usually state I want this many printed reports or this many public meetings as part of my public outreach tasks. So quantity is going to be important as you're thinking about your key task and deliverables. Then also format. When we start talking about billing and things, which is not the most interesting thing, the invoicing, there's usually very specific things that your finance department's going to want. So you're going to be able to have to be able to relate those things in your scope. But format can also be like thinking through, oh, in the final document, I want to have my study in a perfect bound versus a spiral bound. It's all kinds of things. So just be thinking about it. It's all the details. Really, scopes are just helping you organize your thoughts and having clear expectations set. And as I said before, staff resources are really important. You got to know how many people you're working with, and then you also want to have a really good idea of the skill sets on those teams so you can help manage workloads, expectations, and get the clear direction you want. And then we talked about this a bit briefly, timeline. Do I have 6 months to do this? Do I have a year? I recently worked on a project where I had basically like 2 months to get it done. And so how that budget was spent and how those tasks were developed were all centered around that timeline. And that was really, really, really important. And so your timeline is going to be important with it. And you want to think about not only your timeline from a workload standpoint, because if you have another big project coming up, you might need to truncate something. But largely, I think about for certain deadlines, like with funding or adoptions, that's usually going to drive my timeline. What's the drop dead date? I need to get something to council or to my board and council. So key takeaways from chapter 3 are going to be thinking about what level of detail you can get to. And like I said, your budget's really going to drive a lot of that. Are you trying to get to just adoptable? You're trying to get to constructable? Or is there going to be a phase 2 where you get to some of those follow-up steps like a code for adoption, incentives to adopt, or getting to, you know, developing certain projects out of it? And it could be a hybrid. This is just giving you ideas on how to think about developing your scope. I've talked, I feel like, a lot about the budget, but especially if you're working with a local government, those things are going to be pretty tight sometimes. And so that's going to be a big factor in how you're going to scope your project. What are the people resources that are available? You don't want to burn out your team. You want to have clear roles and responsibilities. If you want the consultants to do your printing and your agendas and the setup for the public meeting, that needs to be clearly aligned in the scope. Because you do have to think to yourself, do you want them charging that time to a specific budget? Or do you have the staff resource to do that? Do you want your team in-house doing the graphics and some of the modeling or things like that? Or should that be given to a consultant? Those are things you have to think through based on who you've got working for you. And then as far as when the plan would be finished, that's all depending on what the goal of the study is. And we need to get that done and across the finish line to your council, to your board, or to whatever body you're working with, to the neighborhood, whomever it may be. Your timeline and how fast things move will also shape how you develop your scope. And so in chapter 4, we're going to be going a little bit more detailed into the process. What do these key tasks look like? How do you define your planning process in your scope of work? So see you on the other side in chapter 4.